Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara. Today I'm going to be doing two Speedy book reviews. On one hand, I'm going to be talking about a Japanese book, and that is Silence by Shusaku Endo. And then on the other hand, I'm going to be talking about a Russian book, and that is The Cossacks by Leo Tolstoy. Now, what's really interesting is that both of these authors actually have some quite interesting parallels in terms of how they approach their writing. It wasn't my intention to talk about those parallels in this video, and I probably will only briefly touch upon it, but I have found it quite fascinating now that I've read quite a few Japanese books and quite a few Russian books, that there are quite a lot of parallels in terms of how they approach the discussion around the human condition. So with that in mind, I'm going to do non-spoiler quick reviews. I'll try to keep it to 3 to 4 minutes each maximum. And let's start with Silence by Shusaku Endo. Now, as many of you know, I absolutely adore this author. The Samurai is one of my favorite books of all time, without a doubt. I can't stop talking about it. And so I naturally had to read Silence, because Silence is set in a similar time frame, and it's kind of tackling some of the same questions around faith, around belief, and what it means to be a part of an institution that is trying to espouse a certain set of beliefs. In Silence, we are following our main character, Father Rodriguez, as he sets sail for Japan, as he goes to rescue his teacher, Ferreira, who has been imprisoned by the Japanese. We fairly quickly learn, and this is not a spoiler because it is literally written on the back of the book, that his teacher, Ferreira, has actually renounced his faith. And so our main character, Rodriguez, is trying to tackle with that idea of what it means to have faith, and can we have faith if it isn't public. And with this book, as usual, that I've come to expect now with Endo, is that he approaches this topic with a lot of tact. It is really, really beautifully written, and because it is written in first person, it does have an extra layer of intimacy that we didn't necessarily get in The Samurai. We are also following one main character, so we are seeing his struggle with his identity, with his faith, as he is learning certain things, not only about the people around him and the people that he knows or that he thought he knew, but also as he approaches a completely new country, a completely new culture that is naturally completely foreign to him. I think my favorite thing about this book is how Endo approaches the thematic work. I think there is a level of nuance that you have to have when you handle this sort of topic, because it's a very sensitive topic. I think a lot of people, particularly around the topic of faith and religion, it can be quite divisive, and I think he approaches it in a way that feels very honest, feels very raw, and feels very relatable to a lot of people, even those who might not necessarily follow a specific religion. The writing in this one, I feel, was maybe a little bit more disjointed than in The Samurai. I think The Samurai flows so beautifully, that book, and I think there is a level of imagery that Endo captures that is just so stunning, and I felt like that was missing from this book. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I just think, having read The Samurai coming into this book, I maybe had the same expectation, and that probably isn't fair. But I think if you're reading this as your first Endo book, or you read this before The Samurai, then I don't necessarily think you're going to have that same issue. Overall, I think it was absolutely fantastic. It is definitely a book that I would recommend for anybody who's interested in Japanese history and culture, but also for anybody who's interested in the topic of like religion and faith and what it actually means to have faith. The next book that I'm going to talk about is The Cossacks by Leo Tolstoy. Now that I've read two of his shorter stories, I can say that I just think he's an absolutely phenomenal writer. Like, there is a lyricalism to his writing that I have seen in some of the other Russian authors. I think they all have that to some extent, but I think Tolstoy has it just to another level. I think the way that he paints the imagery in this book in particular is just absolutely stunning. Like, I think you could very easily make a short film or a limited TV series based on this book, because he really paints such a stunning picture of what the kind of Russian countryside looks like, the more kind of rural areas. So with that in mind, let's jump into a quick summary of what this book is about. We are following a young idealist who goes by the name of Dmitry Olenin. He basically leaves Moscow to go and start a new life in the Caucasus. And so we see Olenin kind of transition from being very much in, the heart of Russia and being in a much more urban lifestyle. And what I really liked is seeing how he tackles a completely new environment that is just completely foreign to him. I think Olenin is a really relatable character, and I think he really is the center of this book. He also, as part of that experience, kind of becomes completely enraptured by his surroundings, and he becomes to really appreciate it. It's not a sudden thing that happens overnight. he starts to realize that a life in a more rural area where you're surrounded by natural beauty isn't necessarily a poor existence to live. He also comes from a military background, so, you know, he's used to being in a very kind of high octane environment. So going from a kind of denser city, living the life of a soldier, and then going to the Caucasus, going to a much more rural area where it's quieter and there is a much bigger focus on like community and nature and embracing nature. Like there's a really nice progression that we see this character come to terms with, that his environment is actually indicative of something bigger than just being in, you know, a specific place, if that makes sense. Briefly touched upon it, but one of my favorite things about this book is just the insanely beautiful descriptions that we get of the landscape. I think Tolstoy is just really great at capturing the imagination of the reader by painting almost like, it's like he is a painter. I feel like I could draw a picture or paint a painting based on Tolstoy's descriptions of the environment. Like it really does transport you to rural Russia. It's just such a beautiful picture to paint, and I honestly just lapped it up and almost wish we had a longer book so that I could get more descriptions. Naturally, with a book like this, Lenin does become friends with a Cossack who goes by the name of Iroshka, and kind of fun ensues in a way. But in the backdrop, there's this really interesting kind of, I don't know if it's necessarily a discussion, but there is this kind of historical context of what was going on between the Chechens and the Cossacks, because one of the kind of big plot points of the story, and again, this is not a spoiler, you learn it if you read a plot summary of the book, is that one of our younger Cossacks, who goes by the name of Luko, actually kills a Chechen. And the reason why he kills this Chechen is because they are trying to cross over into their camp to basically scout them out and spy on them. So there is this little bit of added tension of this conflict that is happening between the Cossacks and the Chechens. I'll be honest, I didn't know anything about, but I did do a little bit of reading afterwards, and I was quite interested between how the Cossacks and the Chechens were kind of constantly embattled with each other. And I think the historical context around that is like potentially another video for another day if anybody's interested in it. But there's some really interesting discussion around the different peoples that made up the Caucasus at that time and kind of what was happening in the rural areas, because I think a lot of the focus is on the kind of more urban areas, but there was a lot of interesting political stuff and social stuff happening outside of that as well. Lastly, I will mention about this book is that there is a lot of discussion around like love and the role of women, because our main character, Lenin, actually falls in love with one of the Cossack women, and she goes by the name of Maryanka. It's really interesting because his impression of women is very naive, and it's very, I don't mean to be kind of harsh, but it's quite silly in a way. It's very idealistic, and he doesn't really understand kind of the role of the woman in Cossack society and Cossack communities, and it's very different to say in kind of more urban and built up areas. And I thought that discussion was really interesting. I think the women in this book hold quite a lot of power, but it's a different kind of power than maybe one would expect in a typical Western society at that time, or even just in a more urban society at that time. So overall, I love this book. I think if you're looking for a relatively quick read that's going to just completely transport you and also highlight a kind of section of the world that maybe you don't know a lot about and maybe doesn't get talked a lot about in, at least in the UK. Like, we don't do anything about Russia, to be honest, and we don't especially do anything about the more rural parts of Russia and kind of what was happening at the time that this book was written, which was in the 1860s. So I think it's just, it gives you enough of an insight to give you a bit of a flavour of what was happening, and then if you do want to delve deeper into it, you absolutely can. So there we have it. Both of these books were phenomenal, and both of these books were great for like slightly different reasons. But the great thing is that both of these books are also relatively quick reads. So if you want something that's a nice kind of palette cleanser, or you want something that's going to give you insight into different periods of history but give it to you like in a snapshot, then I think you can't really go wrong with either of these books. And they're both books that are good, I think, to give you a flavour of both of these writers as well. So definitely pick them up if any of this sounded interesting. So there we have it. Thanks for watching, folks. I definitely did go a little bit over my allotted time, but it is what it is. And I hope you liked it. If you have read either of these books, or based on what I've said, there's any other historical fiction books that you'd like to recommend, then please do in the comments down below. If you like my video, please do give it a thumbs up, and I will see you in my next one. Thanks for watching, folks. Stay safe, take care, and I will see you very, very soon. Bye.